Good evening and welcome. Today we shall be reading The Metaphysics of War by Julius Evola, Chapter 5, The Metaphysics of War, originally published on the 13th of August 1935 as Metafisica della Guerra in diorama mensile Il Regime Fascista. We will conclude our series of essays for the diorama on the subject of war as a spiritual value by discussing another tradition within the Indo-European heroic cycle, that is of the Bhagavad-Gita, which is a very well-known text of ancient Hindu wisdom compiled essentially for the warrior caste. We have not chosen this text arbitrarily, and we would not wish anyone to imagine that we offer a newspaper like the regime articles on exotic subjects as objects of mere curiosity. Now that our discussion of the Islamic tradition has allowed us to express in general terms the idea that the internal or greater war is the attainable counterpart and soul of the external war, so the discussion of the tradition contained in the aforementioned text will allow us to present a clear and concise metaphysical version and vision on the matter. Vision of the matter. Christ, I'm mumbling today. On a more exterior plane, such a discussion of the Hindu East, which is the great heroic East, not that of the theosophists, humanitarian pantheists, or the old gentlemen in rapture before the various Gandhis and Rabindranath Tagore's. Okay. And Rabindranath Tagore, 1861 to 1941, was a highly influential Bengali artist and philosopher who won the 1913 Nobel Prize in Literature, which brought him great international fame at the time Evola was writing. Although Tagore drew upon his native Hindu tradition in his works, he emphasized the individual over tradition and integrated elements of artistic modernism into his works. From the perspective of Evola's conception of tradition, therefore, he was a poor representative of the Hindu tradition. Interesting. So therefore, let us reread from the top of that paragraph, perhaps with a touch less, mistranslation and misreading. On a more exterior plane, such a discussion of the Hindu East, which is the great heroic East, not that of the theosophists, humanitarian pantheists, or old gentlemen in rapture before the various Gandhis and Rabindranath Tagores, will assist also in the correction of a viewpoint and the supra-traditional understanding, which are among the first necessities for the new Italian. For too long, we have permitted an artificial antithesis between East and West. Artificial because, as Mussolini has already pointed out, it opposes to the East the modern and materialistic West, which, in fact, has little in common with the older, truer, and greater Western civilization. The modern West is just as opposed to the ancient West as it is to the East. As soon as we refer to previous times, we are effectively in the presence of an ethnic and cultural heritage which is, to a large extent, common to both, and which can only be described as Indo-European, quote-unquote. The original ways of life, the spirituality, and the institutions of the first colonizers of India and Iran have many points of contact not only with those of the Hellenic and Nordic peoples, but also with those of the original Romans themselves. The tradition to which we have previously referred often offers examples of this, most notably a common spiritual conception of how to wage war, how to act and die heroically. Contrary to the views of those who, on the basis of prejudices and platitudes, cannot hear of Hindu civilization without thinking of nirvana, fakirs, escapism, negation of the Western values of personhood, and so on. The text to which we have alluded, and on which we will base our discussion, is presented in the form of a conversation between the warrior Arjuna and the divine Krishna, who acts as the spiritual master of the former. The conversation takes place shortly before a battle in which Arjuna, the victim of humanitarian scruples, is reluctant to participate. In the previous article, we have already indicated that from a spiritual point of view, the two persons, Arjuna and Krishna, are in reality one. They represent two different parts of this human being, two halves of the same whole. Arjuna, the principle of action, and Krishna, that of transcendent knowledge. The conversation can thus be understood as a sort of monologue, developing a progressive inner clarification and solution, both in the heroic and the spiritual sense, of the problem of the warrior's activity which poses itself to Arjuna as he prepares for battle. Now the pity which prevents the warrior from fighting when he recognizes among the ranks of enemy some of his erstwhile friends and closest relatives is described by Krishna, that is to say, by the spiritual principle as impurities, not at all befitting a man who knows the value of life. They lead not to the higher planets, but to infamy. We have here 2:2 in brackets, and citation for that, from A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Bhagavad-Gita, as it is. All quotes from the Bhagavad-Gita are taken from this edition. Terribly sorry for the butchered notes here. I'm not exactly fluent in these older dead languages. Anyway, continuing here. We have already seen this theme appear many times in the traditional teachings of the West. Either you will be killed on the battlefield and attain the heavenly planets, or you will conquer and enjoy the earthly kingdom. Therefore, get up with determination and fight. 2:37. So that can only be chapter 2, verse 37 of, I'm assuming, the Bhagavad-Gita or the previous text that was cited before, namely, that's Bhagavad-Gita as it is thing, or whatever it is. I'm not entirely certain. Terribly sorry if I'm rambling here. However, along with this, the motif of the inner war to be fought at the same moment is outlined, thus knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence. O mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence and thus, by spiritual strength, conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Chapter 3, verse 43. The internal enemy, which is passion, the animal thirst for life, is thus the counterpart of the external enemy. This is how the right orientation is defined. Therefore, O Arjuna, surrendering all your works unto me, with full knowledge of me, without desire for profit, with no claims to proprietorship, and free from lethargy, fight. Chapter 3, verse 30. This demand for a lucid, supraconscious heroism rising above the passions is important, as is this excerpt, which brings out the character of purity and absoluteness which action should have so as to be considered sacred war. Do thou fight for the sake of fighting, without considering happiness or distress, loss or gain, victory or defeat? And by so doing, you shall never incur sin. Chapter 2, verse 38. We find therefore that the only fault or sin is the state of an incomplete will, of an action which inwardly is still far from the height from which one's own life matters as little as those of others, and no human measure has value any longer. It is precisely in this respect that the text in question contains considerations of an absolute metaphysical order, intended to show how that which acts in the warrior at such a level is not so much a human force as a divine force. The teachings with Krishna, that is to say, the knowledge principle given to Arjuna, which is again to say the action principle, to make his doubts vanish, aims, first of all, at making him understand the distinction between what, as absolute spirituality, is incorruptible, and what, as the human and naturalistic element, exists only illusorily. Those who are seers of the truth have concealed that of the non-existent, the material body. There is no endurance, and of the eternal, the soul, there is no change. That which pervades the entire body you should know to be indestructible. No one is able to destroy that imperishable soul. Neither he who thinks the living entity the slayer, nor he who thinks it slain, is in knowledge. For the self slays not, nor is slain. He is not slain when the body is slain. The material body of the indestructible, immeasurable, and eternal living entity is sure to come to an end. Therefore, fight. Chapter 2, verses 16, 17, 19, 20, and 18 of the Bhagavad-Gita, or Bhagavad-Gita. But there is more. The consciousness of the metaphysical unreality of what one can lose, or can cause another to lose, such as the ephemeral life and the mortal body, a consciousness which corresponds to the definition of human existence as a mere pastime. In one of the traditions which we have already considered, is associated with the idea that spirit, in its absoluteness and transcendence, can only appear as a destructive force towards everything which is limited and incapable of overcoming its own limited nature. Thus, the problem arises of how the warrior can evoke the spirit, precisely in virtue of his being necessarily an instrument of destruction and death, and identify with it. The answer to this problem is precisely what we find in our texts. The god not only declares, "I am the strength of the strong, devoid of passion and desire. I am the original fragrance of the earth, and I am the heat and fire. I am the life of all that lives, and I am the penance of all ascetics. I am the original seed of all existences, the intelligence of the intelligent, and the prowess of all powerful men." Chapter 7, verses 11, 9, and 10. But finally, the god reveals himself to Arjuna in the transcendent and fearful form of lightning. We thus arrive at this general vision of life, like electrical bulbs too brightly lit, like circuits invested with too high a potential. Human beings fall and die only because a power burns within them which transcends their finitude, which goes beyond everything they can do and want. This is why they develop, reach a peak, and then, as if overwhelmed by the wave which up to a given point had carried them forward, sink, dissolve, die, and return to the unmanifest. But the one who does not fear death, the one who is able, so to speak, to assume the powers of death by becoming everything which it destroys, overwhelms, and shatters, this one finally passes beyond limitation. He continues to remain upon the crest of the wave. He does not fall, and what is beyond life manifests itself within him. Thus, Krishna, the personification of the principle of spirit, after having revealed himself fully to Arjuna, can say, "With the exception of you, all the soldiers here on both sides shall be slain. Therefore, get up, prepare to fight and win glory. Conquer your enemies and enjoy a flourishing kingdom. They are already put to death by my arrangement, and you, O Arjuna, can be but an instrument in the fight. Therefore, kill them and do not be disturbed. Simply fight, and you will vanquish your enemies in battle." Verses 32 through 34. Or unless those are chapters 32 and 34, but I doubt it. Yes, definitely verses 32 and 34 of the aforementioned chapter. We see here again the identification of war with the path of God, of which we spoke in the previous article. The warrior ceases to act as a person, as an individual. When he attains this level, a great non-human force transfigures his action, making it absolute and pure precisely at its extreme. Here is a view, evocative image, belonging to the same tradition. Here is a very evocative image, belonging to the same tradition. Life, like a bow, the mind, like the arrow, the target to pierce, the supreme spirit, to join mind to spirit as the shot arrow hits its target. This is one of the highest forms of metaphysical justification of war, one of the most comprehensive images of war as sacred war. To conclude this excursion into the forms of heroic tradition, as presented to us by many different times and peoples, we will only add a few final words. We have made this voyage into a world which to come could seem autre, and autre is French for to go to excess, so excessive. We have made this voyage into a world which to some could seem excessive and irrelevant, out of curiosity not to display peculiar erudition. We have undertaken it instead with the precise intention of showing that the sacrality of war, that is to say, that which provides a spiritual justification for war and the necessity of war, constitutes a tradition in the highest sense of the term. It is something which has appeared always and everywhere, in the ascending cycle of every great civilization, while the neurosis of war, the humanitarian and pacifist deprecation of it, as well as the conception of war as a sad necessity or a purely political or natural phenomenon, none of this corresponds to any tradition. All this is but a modern fabrication born yesterday, as a side effect of the decomposition of the democratic and materialistic civilization against which today new revolutionary forces are rising up. In this sense, everything which we have gathered from a great variety of sources, constantly separating the essential from the contingent, the spirit from the letter, can be used by us as an inner fortification, as a confirmation, as a strengthened certainty. Not only does a fundamentally virile instinct appear justified by it on a superior basis, but also the possibility presents itself of determining the forms of the heroic experience which corresponds to our highest vocation. Here we must refer to the first article of this series, in which we showed that there can be heroes of very different sorts, even of an animalistic and sub-personal sort. What matters is not merely the general capacity to throw oneself into combat and to sacrifice oneself, but also the precise spirit according to which such an event is experienced. But we now have all the elements needed to specify, from all the varied ways of understanding, the heroic experience, which may be considered the supreme one, and which we can make the identification of war with the path of God really true. Allow me to reread that sentence. I think I may have missed a few words. But we now have all the elements needed to specify, from all the varied ways of understanding, the heroic experience which may be considered the supreme one, and which can make the identification of war with the path of God really true, and can make one recognize in the hero a form of divine manifestation. Another previous consideration must be recalled, namely that as the warrior's vocation really approaches this metaphysical peak and reflects the impulse to what is universal, it cannot be helped but tend towards an equally universal manifestation and end for his race. That is to say, it cannot but predestine that race for empire, for only the empire as a superior order in which a pax triumphalis, which is Latin for peace through victory, is in force, almost as the earthly reflection of the sovereignty of the supraworld. is adapted to forces in the field of spirit, which reflect the great and free energies of nature, and are able to manifest the character of purity, power, irresistibility, and transcendence over all pathos, passion, and human limitation. This concludes Chapter 5 of the Metaphysics of War by Julius Evola. Battle, Victory, and the World Tradition. Next, for Chapter 6, we have Army, quote-unquote, as Vision of the World. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.